A night of escape, a mistake impossible to erase. She slept with a stranger, unaware that the next day that man would be the millionaire judge about to decide her fate. If you enjoy love stories, romance, subscribe to this channel, leave your comment. Every day we post videos like this continuing. It all began at a lavish ball at the Plaza Hotel, overlooking Central Park in New York City. Letitia Miller shouldn't have been there, a reserved architect, more accustomed to technical blueprints and models than to evening gowns and champagne flutes. The 32-year-old woman, with brown hair, always tied in a discreet bun, and an analytical gaze behind her thin-rimmed glasses, had been invited by Marina Peterson, an influential client who had insisted so much that she couldn't refuse. Standing near one of the enormous columns of the Golden Ballroom, Letitia observed the environment like someone watching a spectacle from another world. The calculated smiles, the exaggerated toasts, the measured steps of people who seemed to move in a rehearsed choreography of power and influence. Her navy blue dress, the most elegant she could find in her minimalist wardrobe, seemed too simple in that ocean of jewels and imported fabrics. And that's when she saw him. Among the indifferent suited men, he stood out not only for his physical imposing presence, but for something in his gaze, a look that cut through the crowd with a disconcerting mix of coldness and melancholy. Tall, with graying hair at the temples, contrasting with the still predominant black, impeccable posture, and a presence that seemed to demand respect without uttering a word. Letitia felt an inexplicable shiver. She recognized him immediately. Edward Thompson, the most feared judge of the Federal Financial Crimes Division in New York City. The same man who 3 years ago had publicly criticized an architectural project for a courthouse she had signed, calling it aesthetically pretentious and functionally deficient in an interview for an architecture magazine. The criticism had bruised her professional pride at the time, but Letitia had moved on. Now, seeing him in person for the first time, she felt a confused mix of resentment and fascination. Why, among all the people in that crowded ballroom, did her eyes keep returning to him? When their gazes finally met, there was no room for pleasantries. The judge seemed to recognize her too, and something in his expression subtly changed. An invisible tension settled in the air, an instinctive recognition as if both knew that this encounter was not accidental. Edward Thompson maintained eye contact for too long for it to be casual, and Letitia, on an impulse she didn't understand, held his gaze instead of looking away. Marina, circulating through the ballroom like a fish in water, noticed the exchange of glances and approached Letitia with a mischievous smile. "I see you and Judge Thompson have already met," she commented, holding a champagne flute. "Only visually," Letitia replied, trying to sound indifferent. "He criticized a project of mine a few years ago." "Oh, Edward is just like that, rigorous in everything. They say he doesn't even approve of his own reflection in the mirror," Marina laughed, and then, to Letitia's horror, gestured, calling the judge over. "Come, I'll introduce you formally. He's a friend of my husband's." Edward Thompson approached with an elegance that defied his reputation for rigidity. His steps were confident, measured, as if every movement was calculated. Up close, Letitia noticed details that distance concealed, small lines of expression around his dark eyes, his perfectly trimmed beard, the discreet but distinctive cologne. "Edward, this is Letitia Miller, the architect who redesigned my house in the Hamptons. Letitia, this is Judge Edward Thompson." "Miss Miller," he said with a deep, controlled voice, extending his hand. "I believe we have met before, albeit indirectly." "Through your comment on the Brooklyn Borough Courthouse," Letitia completed, shaking his hand with deliberate firmness. "Hard to forget such an incisive analysis." A flash of surprise crossed his eyes, quickly replaced by a calculated interest. He wasn't accustomed to being confronted, especially at social events where everyone seemed eager to please him. "I stand by my opinion on the project," he replied without mincing words, "although I recognize there is talent behind the flaws." Marina, sensing the growing tension, smiled nervously and murmured something about needing to greet other guests, moving away with the skill of someone who knows when a conversation no longer needs mediation. The dialogue that followed was brief, sharp, full of subtle provocations masked by social courtesy. Letitia defended her architectural choices with contained passion, while Edward challenged her with precise questions that revealed a surprising knowledge of architecture. It was a verbal duel disguised as casual conversation, and both seemed energized by the confrontation. "The problem with your project wasn't technical, but philosophical," he argued, as they walked slowly through the ballroom, moving away from the center of the party. A courthouse should express solidity and reliability, not experimentalism. Shouldn't justice also be transparent and accessible, or do you prefer courts to continue looking like intimidating temples where only the initiated feel comfortable? She countered. Edward opened his mouth to reply, but then something unexpected happened. Letitia smiled, not a polite or forced smile, but a genuine one that lit up her face and softened her defensive posture. It was as if, for an instant, she had seen beyond the public figure of the feared judge, and found something that amused her. "What is it?" he asked, intrigued. "Nothing," Letitia replied. "I just realized it's the first time in years I've discussed architecture with such intensity. It's refreshing." The unexpected comment disarmed Edward. The man who was never surprised in his own court, who maintained a public image of emotional impenetrability, felt something give way inside him. It wasn't just Letitia's discreet beauty that attracted him now, but the way she challenged him fearlessly, how her gaze revealed an intelligence that wasn't intimidated by his reputation. "Care to dance?" he asked almost impulsively when the orchestra began to play a waltz. Letitia hesitated, surprised by the invitation and by her own desire to accept. "I'm not very good at it," she admitted. "Neither am I," Edward confessed, offering his arm. "But I have a good sense of rhythm and balance. They are requirements for my work." The dance that followed was less a choreography and more a silent battle of wills. Their bodies moved in perfect synchrony, despite the tension between them. Edward led her with firmness and precision, while Letitia followed him without submission, maintaining a distance that was simultaneously proper and provocative. "You're not what I expected, Judge Thompson," she said as they spun among other couples. "And what did you expect? Someone more inflexible, colder?" "Perhaps I am exactly that," he replied, his voice lower, "in the courtroom. And outside of it?" The question hung in the air, laden with implications. Edward didn't answer with words, but his fingers lightly pressed Letitia's back, bringing her a little closer. The movement was almost imperceptible to observers, but for them it was like a silent confession. The music ended, but they remained close, for a second longer than necessary. It was Letitia who pulled away first, regaining her composure. "I need some air," she murmured, feeling suddenly suffocated by the intensity of the moment. Edward nodded, understanding the unspoken. "The terrace is empty at this hour." They discreetly headed out of the ballroom, crossing corridors decorated with contemporary American art, until they reached a spacious terrace that offered a breathtaking view of Central Park, illuminated by the full moon. The sea breeze brought some relief from the heat they both felt, not only from the ballroom's atmosphere, but from their proximity to each other. "Better?" Edward asked, observing how the moonlight transformed Letitia's face, softening her determined features. She nodded, leaning on the railing. "You don't usually frequent these social events, I imagine." "Not by choice," he admitted. "I only come when my absence would be noticed or interpreted as arrogance." "Public image," Letitia commented. "I know that game well." "It's more than a game for me," Edward said, his tone suddenly serious. "It's a responsibility. People place trust in the system I represent. And does that justify the isolation, the constant rigidity?" The question hit him at a vulnerable point. Edward was rarely questioned about his personal choices, about the price he paid for the position he held. Turning to face her, he studied her face for a moment before answering. "There are choices we make and consequences we accept," he finally said. "Some positions don't allow for compromise." "That sounds lonely," Letitia observed, with a softness that surprised her. "And you?" he asked, shifting the focus. "A talented architect, clearly uncomfortable at social events, No ring on your finger. Haven't your choices isolated you too? Letitia felt the precise hit. It was as if he had read pages of her life, with just one glance. "Touché," she replied with a bitter smile. "It seems we both sacrifice certain things for our principles." The conversation then flowed into less personal territories: literature, classical music, New York's urban problems. But something had changed. Between polite phrases and shared opinions, a connection grew that neither of them had experienced before. A mutual understanding that transcended words. They lost track of time. The party continued distantly, the sound of music and conversations muffled on the terrace. The world seemed to have shrunk to that space, that moment, those two people who discovered, with surprise and resistance, how similar they were in their differences. It was Edward who checked his watch, frowning. "It's late." "I should go back," Letitia agreed, without moving. "Me too." Neither of them moved. The air between them seemed charged with electricity, dense with unexpressed possibilities. "This is a mistake," Edward murmured, taking a step towards her. "Probably," Letitia agreed, also approaching. When their lips met, there was no initial gentleness, no hesitation. It was an urgent, almost desperate kiss, as if both had waited too long for something they didn't even know they desired. His hands found her waist, while she wrapped her arms around his neck, pulling their bodies closer with a need that defied reason. Between the muffled sound of the ballroom and the accelerated beat of their own hearts, they surrendered to impulses they had long repressed. Edward pressed her against the wall, his hands exploring the curves of her body with an urgency that contradicted his usual restraint. Letitia pulled him closer, her fingers disheveling his always perfect hair, undoing his tie with a boldness she never imagined she possessed. "My room," he whispered against her neck. "On the top floor." The silent question was answered, with an even more intense kiss. Without another word, they moved away from the terrace, crossing secondary corridors to avoid being seen. The private elevator seemed to move with unbearable slowness, each second of forced proximity increasing the tension between them. Their breaths quickened, their gazes unwavering, the minimal distance they maintained only out of awareness of their location. When the door finally opened directly into the presidential suite, there was no more restraint. Clothes were discarded on the way to the bed, hands exploring newly exposed skin, lips marking territories never before claimed. The partial darkness of the room, illuminated only by the moonlight entering through the panoramic windows, granted them a freedom that full visibility might deny. Edward laid her on the bed with a reverence that contradicted the urgency of his previous movements. For a moment, he contemplated her, as if wanting to memorize every curve, every shadow, every expression. Letitia, feeling exposed not only physically but emotionally, pulled him to her, unable to bear the weight of that gaze any longer. What followed was a mutual discovery, an exploration of bodies and limits, of repressed desires and hidden vulnerabilities. For the first time in years, he felt simply a man, not a judge, and she, for the first time since losing her parents, let go of control. In their surrender, they found an unexpected freedom. Afterward, lying side by side, breathless and surprisingly satisfied, the silence between them was not awkward, but contemplative. Edward traced invisible patterns on the skin of her back, while Letitia observed his profile against the distant glow of the city that never slept. "What are you thinking about?" he asked, his voice softer than she had ever heard. "How reality sometimes defies all expectations," Letitia replied, resting her head on his chest. "I never imagined this scenario." Edward chuckled softly, the sound reverberating against her ear. "Neither did I. It definitely wasn't in my plans for tonight. Do you have plans for every night?" "For most of them. Order and predictability are anchors." Letitia propped herself up on her elbow to look at him. "And what happens when the anchors are lifted?" "This," he replied, caressing her face with a tenderness that surprised her. "Drift, chaos, freedom." They talked for hours, discovering details about each other that they never imagined sharing with anyone. He spoke about the constant pressure of judging, lives about the isolation he imposed on himself to maintain integrity. She told him about the premature death of her parents, about how architecture had become her refuge and her prison, about failed relationships because she could never give up control. They fell asleep in each other's arms, overcome by physical exhaustion and the emotional drain of broken barriers. When morning arrived, bringing reality with its merciless light, Letitia woke with a start, checking the clock with alarm. "My God, I'm late," she murmured, jumping up and searching for her clothes scattered around the room. "I have a meeting with the City Department of Public Works in less than an hour." Edward watched her dress hurriedly, with an expression that mixed admiration and something close to melancholy. He didn't try to stop her, nor did he make empty promises about a next meeting. Both were too adult to pretend that the world outside didn't exist, that their lives and responsibilities weren't waiting for them beyond those doors. "May I have your number?" he asked, when she was almost ready. Letitia hesitated for a moment, then nodded, dictating the digits as he recorded them on his phone. She approached the bed for a last kiss, which began brief and almost formal, but deepened when Edward pulled her back to him. "I have to go," she whispered against his lips, pulling away reluctantly. "I know." She left in a hurry, leaving behind not only a man wrapped in silk sheets and enveloped in contemplative silence, but also a part of herself she had thought lost long ago. In the days that followed, Letitia tried to resume her routine, immersing herself in the projects she supervised and the meetings she coordinated. But her phone seemed to weigh in her pocket, and her thoughts kept returning to that night at the plaza, to those moments of unexpected connection. Edward's first message arrived 3 days later, formal, almost distant. "I hope your meeting was productive. Edward Thompson." Letitia responded after hours of deliberation, equally contained. "It was successful, thank you. Letitia Miller." Gradually, the messages became more frequent and less formal. Comments about the day, observations about places or situations that reminded them of each other. Small confessions about how the shared night remained vivid in their memories. She, who never smiled at her phone, now did so with increasing frequency. He, accustomed to emotional detachment, began to eagerly await each reply. A month after the ball, they met again, this time in a small restaurant in Greenwich Village, far from familiar eyes. The initial tension quickly gave way to a surprising familiarity, as if they had known each other for years, not weeks. They talked about everything and nothing, laughed at things only they understood, exchanged glances laden with promises for later. From that night onward, a discreet routine began. Meetings in secluded places, nights in his apartment with a view of the Brooklyn Bridge and the Manhattan skyline, or in her minimalist loft in Soho. They never spoke about the future, about definitions or expectations. They lived each moment as if it were unique, with no plans beyond the next encounter. But fate, always ironic, began to weave another plot. One October morning, Letitia noticed subtle signs of surveillance. A car parked for too long near her office, calls that dropped as soon as she answered, the feeling of being watched when she went out for lunch. At first, she attributed it to paranoia, the natural fear that her secret relationship with Edward would be discovered, until on a rainy Wednesday, a federal agent entered her office with a sealed envelope, a subpoena. She would be heard as a key witness in a corruption case involving Miller and Albright Construction, where she had worked for 5 years before opening her own architectural studio. The news itself would have been disturbing. The construction company had belonged to her father and had been sold after his death, and any association with corruption would tarnish not only her reputation, but also his memory. But the real blow came when she read the name of the judge responsible for the case, Edward Thompson. The floor dropped, out from under her. The revelation was a double blow, legal and emotional. Any rumor about their involvement could destroy their reputations, invalidate the process, and turn them into public targets. The conflict of interest was evident, and the consequences potentially devastating. To protect Edward and the integrity of the case, Letitia made a drastic decision to disappear from his life. Without explanations, without proper goodbyes. She sent a single message, cold and distant. I need space. Please don't look for me anymore. The pain she felt as she typed those words was physical, as if something broke inside her. But the alternative seemed worse. Edward being accused of partiality, losing the credibility built over 2 decades, having his career destroyed because of an involvement no one would understand. The case was too big, involving powerful figures from New York's political and business scene. The spotlights would be on everyone involved. Edward tried to make contact. Calls she didn't answer. Messages she read with a heavy heart, but didn't reply to. One night, he showed up at her building, but she instructed the doorman to say she was traveling. She saw him on the security camera, standing on the sidewalk in the rain, looking up at her window with an expression she would never forget. After weeks of frustrated attempts, Edward finally respected her silence. Like the disciplined judge he was, he channeled his confusion and pain into work. He became even more rigorous, more isolated, more feared. His reputation for merciless judgments grew, fueled by sentences that left no room for appeal. He turned to stone. He became the man he was before her, cold, inaccessible, solitary. Letitia, in turn, immersed herself in preparing for her testimony. She revisited all the projects she had been involved in. At the construction company, analyzed documents, recalled meetings. The company had been sold after her father's death to a group led by Henry Albright, a longtime family partner and Letitia's godfather. She had stayed out of loyalty, leaving only when she noticed changes in the corporate culture that contradicted the principles her father had always defended. The more she studied the case, the more uneasy she became. The accusations involved overbilling and bribes in public contracts during the period she still worked there. As chief architect, her name was on several mentioned projects, although she was not directly accused of anything. Still, it seemed impossible that such schemes could have occurred without her noticing something. The tension increased when she started receiving anonymous emails, encrypted messages that seemed to warn her, but without enough clarity. Not everything is as it seems. Be careful who you trust. Some architects build prisons, not buildings. Her paranoia grew. She changed her phone, hired a company to check if her apartment was bugged, and began varying her daily routes. She slept poorly, startled by any night noise. In one of these moments of insomnia, revisiting case documents, she noticed something strange. Some dates didn't match. Projects that were supposedly approved by her on days when she was demonstrably out of the country at an international congress of sustainable architecture in Berlin. She began to distrust the evidence. Everything seemed too perfect, as if someone had molded the narrative to incriminate her. Not directly, but enough to tarnish her reputation and, possibly, affect other people. Was she just a means to another end? Needing help, but fearing to trust the wrong people, Letitia turned to someone outside her usual circle. Marcus Rivers, an investigative journalist who had been a close friend of her father's. Years earlier, he had tried to warn her about suspicious changes in the construction company after the patriarch's death, but she, still grieving, had interpreted his warnings as an attempt to tarnish the memory of her deceased friend. The meeting took place in a busy downtown Manhattan cafe. Marcus, now 60, with completely white hair and the same keen gaze as always, listened attentively as she explained her suspicions. "You were right from the start," Letitia admitted, avoiding his eyes. "Something was wrong with the company after my father died. Henry was always ambitious," Marcus replied, without satisfaction at having his judgment confirmed. "But I never thought he would go this far. Using you as a scapegoat is low even for him." "Do you think that's what's happening? That I'm being used?" Marcus leaned forward, lowering his voice. "I've been following this case for months. There are rumors that the real target isn't the construction company, but the judge." "The judge?" Letitia felt her heart race, but maintained a neutral expression. "Edward Thompson?" "Exactly. Thompson has been a thorn in the side of many powerful people. In the last 2 years, he sent 3 state representatives, 1 senator, and over 10 influential businessmen to jail, all for corruption. And they think he has some kind of personal vendetta. More than that, Some say he's building a bigger case that could reach even higher echelons of government. This process involving Miller and Albright Construction could be the tip of the iceberg. But how do I fit into this? Why involve me? Marcus studied her for a moment, as if assessing how much she really knew. Maybe it's just a coincidence. Or maybe... He left the sentence hanging. Maybe what? Maybe someone knows something we don't. The conversation left Letitia even more disturbed. At home, trying to organize her thoughts, she received a call from an unknown number. She hesitated but answered. "Ms. Miller?" The male voice on the other end was deep, formal. "This is Daniel Vance from the FBI. We need to talk about your safety." The meeting was scheduled for the following morning at a precinct in downtown Manhattan. Daniel, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a military bearing, explained that she was being monitored as part of a key witness protection program. "We suspect the case involving the construction company is a smokescreen," he explained. "The real objective might be to compromise Judge Thompson, who has been an important partner in larger investigations." "What do you mean, compromise?" "To force him to recuse himself from the case, or worse, to set up a situation that suggests partiality or corruption. Thompson is known for his unwavering integrity. If they can bring him down, many cases could collapse." "And what am I in all this? Bait?" Daniel didn't answer directly. "What we can say is that your safety is a priority. From now on, you will have discreet 24-hour protection." "That doesn't answer my question," the officer sighed. "Ms. Miller, the less you know, the safer you'll be. I can only say that we trust your integrity as much as Judge Thompson's." In the days that followed, Letitia began to notice the constant presence of disguised agents in her routine. A man reading a newspaper at the cafe where she had breakfast, a woman seemingly shopping at the same store, an extra security guard at her office building. Marcus, on his own, began to investigate. As a respected journalist with decades of experience, he had sources at all levels of government and the judiciary. Gradually, he shared his discoveries with Letitia. "The documents against you were forged," he confirmed, showing copies of emails with altered metadata. "Someone with internal access to the construction company manipulated records to suggest your direct involvement in approving overbuild projects." "But why? What would they gain by involving me?" "I'm still connecting the dots, but one theory is that they knew Thompson would be assigned to the case. Perhaps they wanted to see how he would react to having to judge someone who..." "Someone who what?" Letitia interrupted, tense. Marcus looked at her curiously. "Someone who publicly challenged his authority. Your clash over the courthouse. Project was quite talked about at the time." Letitia relaxed slightly, realizing that Marcus didn't know about her personal involvement with Edward. "That was 3 years ago. It's hardly relevant now." "For people looking for patterns of behavior, it could be," the journalist argued. "Or maybe you're just collateral damage. The important thing is that we're accumulating evidence of the manipulation." As the hearing date approached, the pressure increased. Letitia received an anonymous call in the middle of the night. "Drop the case, confess involvement, or those close to you will suffer." She reported the threat to Daniel, who reinforced her security. But the fear grew, not just for herself, but for Edward. If anyone discovered the relationship they had, the consequences would be catastrophic. On a rainy afternoon, 2 weeks before the hearing, Letitia was in her office when she received an unexpected visit. Henry Albright, her godfather and current owner of the construction company. At 65, Henry maintained the elegance and charm that had always characterized him. Perfectly combed gray hair, impeccable suit, a smile that inspired automatic trust. "Letitia, my dear." He hugged her, as if there were no tension between them, as if she wasn't involved, in a case that could destroy his company. "It's been too long." "Henry," she replied formally, indicating for him to sit. "To what do I owe this visit?" "Concern, pure paternal concern," he said, settling into the chair opposite her desk. "This case is taking on absurd proportions. I wanted to make sure you're well." Letitia studied him, searching for signs of falsehood in the face she had known since childhood. The man who held her hand at her parents' funeral, who promised to care for her like a daughter, who financed her architecture studies. Could it be that this same man was now using her as a pawn in some bigger game? "I'm handling the situation," she replied cautiously. "It's difficult to see my father's company name involved in corruption scandals." "Your father would be devastated," Henry agreed with apparent sincerity. "Charles was always a man of unshakable principles, like you." "What exactly do you want, Henry?" He smiled, acknowledging her characteristic directness. "To help, to offer a way out that protects everyone." "What kind of way out?" "A simple statement, confirming that you approved certain projects without verifying all the cost details. An administrative error, nothing criminal. In return, we withdraw your name from any future proceedings and guarantee your reputation remains intact." Letitia felt her blood run cold. "You're asking me to lie." "I'm asking you to be practical," he corrected, his tone still amiable. "This case will unnecessarily drag names through the mud, including yours." "And the judge? What happens to him if I make this simple statement?" Something subtly changed in Henry's gaze, a flash of interest, as if she had confirmed a suspicion. "Judge Thompson, what does he have to do with your decision?" Letitia realized her mistake. She had revealed more than she intended. "He is known for his integrity. He wouldn't accept a fabricated testimony." "Ah, yes. The incorruptible Edward Thompson," Henry said with slight irony. "But every man has a price, Letitia, or a weakness." "What does that mean?" Henry stood up, meticulously adjusting his suit. "It means I hope you'll consider my offer, for your own good." He walked to the door, but before leaving, he turned. "By the way, I heard Thompson was quite impressed with you at that ball at the plaza. Interesting how the most improbable people can connect." The door closed, leaving Letitia chilled. The message was clear. They knew. Somehow they knew about her and Edward. The initial panic soon gave way to determination. If they intended to use their relationship as a weapon, they would have to face her first. Immediately after Henry's departure, Letitia contacted Marcus and Daniel. In an emergency meeting at a secure location, she reported the visit and its implications. "This confirms that the real target is Thompson," Daniel concluded. "They're using you to get to him." "But how did they know about you two?" Marcus questioned. "You were discreet, weren't you?" Letitia hesitated. She hadn't told the journalist about her relationship with Edward, only that they met at the ball. "There was no us," she replied, technically true. "Just a conversation at the ball that was apparently noticed." "Henry has connections everywhere," Daniel observed. "Eyes and ears in every luxury hotel, restaurant, club. If there was any interaction between you, he could find out." "The important thing now is to anticipate their next move," Marcus intervened. "If Letitia refuses Henry's offer, what happens?" "They have a plan B," Daniel stated. "They always do." The three worked late, discussing strategies and possible scenarios. When Letitia finally arrived home, exhausted, she found her apartment ransacked. Nothing of value had been taken, but her laptop was on. She was sure she had turned it off before leaving, and a drawer of personal documents was ajar. Frightened but refusing to be intimidated, she checked the entire apartment, ensuring she was alone. Then she carefully examined the laptop, finding signs of access to her personal email. Messages had been opened, especially those exchanged with Edward at the beginning of their relationship. The invasion confirmed her suspicions. They were collecting evidence to use against Edward, to prove a personal connection that would compromise his impartiality in the case. This meant that somehow he had resisted previous pressures. He had not recused himself, had not yielded to any attempts at manipulation. Typical of him, Letitia thought, with a mixture of admiration and concern. The next morning she received an anonymous message. "Last chance. Cooperate or the judge falls." Attached, an audio file. An intimate conversation between her and Edward, clearly recorded without their knowledge. Initial despair soon gave way to fury. They had violated not only her professional privacy, but also the most intimate moments she had shared with Edward. This was personal now. She summoned Daniel and Marcus again, sharing the recording and her new determination. "I will no longer hide or run. It's time to fight back. How? Marcus asked. They have resources, influence, political power. And we have the truth, Letitia replied. And the truth, when well documented, is the most powerful weapon. The three devised a risky plan. Marcus would use his journalistic contacts to investigate even more deeply the connections between Henry and political figures. Daniel, through official FBI channels, would obtain authorization to monitor suspicious communications and financial movements. And Letitia would serve as bait. She would pretend to consider Henry's proposal, buying time and collecting more evidence. In the weeks that followed, the web of conspiracy began to unravel. Henry was not acting alone. There were connections with an influential senator, the same one Edward was investigating in another case, and with high-ranking members of the prosecutor's office. They form a perfect triangle, Marcus explained, showing a diagram he had drawn. Henry provides the money, the senator the political power, and the corrupt prosecutors the legal cover. Together they form an almost undetectable money laundering and influence peddling machine. And Edward was the only obstacle, Letitia concluded. The only one they couldn't buy or intimidate, Daniel agreed. That's why they needed to discredit him, and you, unfortunately, became the perfect weapon. As they gathered more evidence, the danger increased. Marcus's car was vandalized. Daniel received veiled threats from superiors suggesting he stop digging where he shouldn't, and the surveillance on Letitia intensified. She felt constant eyes on her, even inside her home. When the day of the hearing finally arrived, Letitia was simultaneously exhausted and electrified. She hadn't slept the night before, reviewing one last time all the evidence they had collected. Evidence of forgery, of manipulation, of a conspiracy whose sole objective was to bring down a man who refused to yield to corruption. She dressed carefully, a grey pantsuit, discreet but elegant. Hair tied in a severe bun, minimal makeup, no accessories other than small pearl earrings, a gift from her father when she graduated. She wanted to appear professional, controlled, unassailable. Before leaving, she looked at herself in the mirror one last time. Her eyes revealed determination, but also fear. Not for herself, but for Edward, for what would happen when they met again after months of forced separation. For what he would think when he discovered that she had pushed him away not out of lack of feeling, but to protect him. "Please understand," she whispered to her reflection, as if rehearsing words for him. "I did what I thought was right." The federal courthouse was surrounded by journalists when she arrived, escorted by Daniel and two other federal agents. Cameras turned in her direction, questions were shouted, flashes fired. Letitia kept her eyes forward, ignoring the chaos around her. In the corridor leading to the courtroom, she found Marcus, who was waiting for her with a folder of documents. "It's all here," he said, handing her the material. "Use it only if absolutely necessary." Letitia nodded, putting the folder in her bag. "And the operation?" "Underway," the journalist confirmed. "Federal agents are in position. If everything goes as planned, Henry and his accomplices will be arrested immediately after the hearing. And if something goes wrong?" Marcus held her hands briefly. "You're not alone this time, Letitia. Remember that." The courtroom was already packed when she entered. Lawyers, assistants, selected press, observers. Henry was there, at a table to the right, with two renowned attorneys. He smiled at her, confident, as if he had already won. Letitia took her seat, sitting upright, hands clasped on the table. She tried to control her breathing, calm her racing heart. And then the side door opened. Edward entered, dressed in the black robe that symbolized his authority. His face revealed nothing, the professional mask firmly in place. But when his eyes met hers, Letitia saw a flash of something. Surprise, pain, confusion, before he regained complete control. In that silent instant, full of memories and wounds, everything became clear to her. Despite everything, despite the time and distance, what they felt for each other remained intact, and that realization, instead of weakening her, gave her even more strength. The hearing was formally opened. The prosecutor, a middle-aged man with a severe expression, began by presenting the case against Miller and Albright Construction, detailing schemes of overbilling and bribes. He then called Letitia to testify, emphasizing her position as former chief architect and her alleged role in approving problematic projects. Letitia took the oath, aware that every word would be analyzed, every expression interpreted. Edward watched her with professional attention, without revealing any personal emotion. "Ms. Miller," the prosecutor began, "could you confirm that this email dated March 15, 2020, where you approved changes to the Municipal Administrative Center project that resulted in a 30% increase in the budget, was written by you? The document was projected onto a large screen." Letitia examined it carefully. It was well done, no doubt. Her digital signature seemed authentic, the email format correct. Even her writing style was precisely replicated. "No, prosecutor," she replied, with a firm voice. "This document is a forgery." A murmur ran through the room. The prosecutor seemed genuinely surprised, or feigned it well. "Are you denying that you wrote this email?" "I am stating that it is a forgery," Letitia repeated. "On March 15, 2020, I was in Berlin, participating in the International Congress of Sustainable Architecture. I have my passport, hotel records, and photos to prove it." The prosecutor hesitated for a moment, then showed another document. "And what about this internal memo, where you instruct your team to adjust technical specifications to accommodate client requirements?" "Also forged," Letitia replied, maintaining her calm. "The date coincides with my period of medical leave after knee surgery. I have hospital records to confirm that." The atmosphere became increasingly tense. With each document presented, Letitia pointed out inconsistencies, temporal impossibilities, technical details that proved forgery. The prosecutor, visibly uncomfortable, became more aggressive in his questioning, pressing her, trying to make her contradict herself. "You seem to have a convenient explanation for every document," he observed with sarcasm. "Are we to believe that there is an elaborate conspiracy just to implicate you?" "Not just to implicate me, prosecutor," Letitia replied, holding his gaze firm, "but to achieve other objectives." Edward, who had been observing silently until then, intervened for the first time. "Ms. Miller, could you elaborate on what you mean?" "By other objectives?" Letitia looked directly at him. This was the decisive moment. "I believe I am being used as a pawn in a larger game, Your Honor. The true objective is to compromise the integrity of this court, and specifically yours." The entire courtroom fell silent with that declaration. Everyone's gaze alternated between Letitia, standing with a defiant posture, and Edward, seated in his high chair, his expression impenetrable. Henry Albright leaned over to whisper something in his lawyer's ear, while the prosecutor seemed momentarily disconcerted. "Miss Miller," Edward said after a calculated silence, his voice controlled and professional, "you are making a serious accusation. Do you have proof to substantiate it?" "Yes, Your Honor," Letitia replied without hesitation. "With the court's permission, I would like to present evidence that my attorney and an investigative journalist have gathered over the past few months." The prosecutor immediately protested, claiming that the evidence had not been submitted previously and could not be admitted. Edward, after brief consideration, decided to allow it. "Given the exceptional nature of the accusations and their relevance to the very functioning of justice, I will allow the witness to present what she has. The court will evaluate admissibility later." Letitia opened her folder and handed copies of the documents to the court officer who distributed them. Meanwhile, she explained what they had discovered. Internal emails from the construction company showing the deliberate fabrication of evidence against her. Communications between Henry and Senator Peter Anderson discussing ways to neutralize Judge Thompson. Suspicious financial transactions coinciding with the dates of important judicial decisions, and most devastatingly, audio recordings of conversations between the present prosecutor and Henry, explicitly planning to use any relationship between Letitia and Edward to force the judge's recusal. "How did you obtain these recordings?" the prosecutor questioned, his voice trembling slightly. "The same way you obtained recordings of me," Letitia replied with controlled coldness. The difference is that ours were judicially authorized by the FBI as part of a corruption investigation. Chaos erupted in the room. Lawyers stood up, voices rose, reporters began furiously writing in their notebooks. Edward pounded his gavel several times, demanding order. His face remained impassive, but those who knew him well could see the tension in his eyes, the rigidity in his jaw. "This hearing is adjourned for 1 hour," he announced, standing up. "All documents will be analyzed in my chambers. Representatives from the FBI and the Federal Prosecutor's Office must report immediately." As the room emptied amid murmurs and speculations, Letitia remained seated, her shoulders finally relaxing after months of tension. Marcus approached, sitting beside her. "You were brilliant," he said with paternal pride. "Your father would be proud." "It's not over," she replied, watching Henry being approached by federal agents in the corridor. "We still don't know how Edward will react." "He'll do what's right," Marcus affirmed. "He always has." During the next hour, the courthouse buzzed with activity. Federal agents entered and exited the judge's chambers. Prosecutors met in closed rooms. Reporters tried to get any information from those involved. Letitia was led to a private room where she waited, trying to control her anxiety. When the hearing resumed, the atmosphere had drastically changed. New prosecutors were present, representing the Federal Prosecutor's Office's Anti-Corruption Task Force. Henry had not returned. He had been detained for questioning. The original prosecutor was absent, also under investigation. Edward entered, his face even graver than before. He sat down, adjusted his robe, and addressed the crowded room. "In light of the preliminary evidence presented, and considering the seriousness of the accusations, this court determines the immediate suspension of this case against Miller and Albright Construction as it was proposed. All evidence will be forwarded to the Anti-Corruption Task Force, which will decide on new accusations involving attempted obstruction of justice and manipulation of evidence." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room before briefly resting on Letitia. "Furthermore, considering the conflict of interest now evidenced, I declare myself recused from continuing to preside over any case involving Ms. Letitia Miller or the construction company in question." A murmur ran through the room. Edward had not elaborated on the nature of the conflict of interest, but the implication was clear to those following the case closely. He continued, his voice firm. "Finally, given the extraordinary circumstances of this case, and recognizing Ms. Miller's courage in bringing to light this attempt to manipulate the judicial system, I formally note my personal determination that a complete and impartial investigation be conducted into all parties involved, including members of the prosecution and the judiciary." He pounded his gavel one last time. "This session is adjourned." The room erupted in activity. Journalists rushed to call their newsrooms, lawyers huddled to discuss the implications, court officers tried to maintain some order. Letitia remained seated, processing what had just happened. Edward had acted exactly as she expected, with integrity, even if it meant personal sacrifice. When she finally stood to leave, she was approached by reporters in the corridor. Questions were fired from all sides. "Ms. Miller, what is your relationship with Judge Thompson? Do you confirm there was a personal relationship? Did Mr. Henry Albright try to blackmail you?" Daniel appeared at her side, clearing a path through the crowd. "No comment at this time," he declared, leading her to a private elevator. "Ms. Miller is under federal protection and will make official statements at the appropriate time." In the elevator, Letitia could finally breathe. "Where is he?" she asked Daniel, without needing to specify who. "In his chambers," the agent replied. "He asked to see you if you agree." Letitia nodded, her heart racing. After months of forced distance, of painful silence, she would finally face Edward face to face, without masks, without pretexts. The judge's chambers were on the top floor of the courthouse, an austere but elegant space, with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves and large windows that offered a panoramic view of the city. Edward was standing by the window, his back to the door, when she entered. He had removed his robe, wearing only his perfectly tailored dark suit. His shoulders seemed laden with an invisible weight. "Edward," she called softly, closing the door behind her. He turned slowly. His face revealed exhaustion and relief in equal measure. For a moment they just looked at each other, the space between them charged with unspoken words, repressed feelings, months of longing and doubt. "Why didn't you tell me?" he finally asked, his voice hoarse with contained emotion. "Why did you disappear like that?" "To protect you," Letitia replied, taking a hesitant step towards him. "When I received the subpoena and saw your name as the judge on the case, I understood that any connection between us would be used against you. Your career, your reputation, everything you worked for. So you decided alone that it was best to distance yourself," he concluded, without accusation, merely stating the fact. "Without giving me a choice, without trusting that we could find a solution together." "There was no clean solution," she argued. "If you immediately recused yourself, it would raise suspicions. If you continued on the case, knowing about what happened between us, you would be compromising your integrity. And you thought I would prefer my career over you?" The question hung in the air, direct and devastating. Letitia felt tears forming, but held them back. "I thought you shouldn't have to choose," she replied, her voice trembling. "Your integrity as a judge is part of who you are, Edward. I couldn't be the person to take that away from you." He walked slowly towards her, closing the physical distance that had existed between them for so long. "You're right about one thing," he said, his voice softer now. "My integrity is fundamental to me. That's why after leaving this room I will submit my resignation to the court." "What?" Letitia stared at him, alarmed. "You can't do that. Not now. Not when we've proven you were right all along." "Precisely because of that," he explained. "My impartiality was compromised not because I yielded to corruption, but because I fell in love. And although I technically violated no rules, our brief involvement occurred before this case, I cannot continue as if nothing happened." "Are you giving up everything because of me?" she asked, guilt evident in her voice. Edward smiled for the first time, a tired but sincere smile. "No, Letitia, I am choosing to be true to myself, and perhaps more importantly, I am finally making a choice instead of simply following the predetermined path." He gently touched her face, his fingers tracing the contour of her cheek with reverence. "These last few months without you were the emptiest of my life. I thought I had lost something I barely had time to recognize I had found." Letitia could no longer hold back her tears. They flowed freely as she allowed herself, finally, to feel everything she had repressed, the fear, the longing, the love that had grown even in absence. "I thought about you every day," she confessed. "I hated having to feign indifference, having to ignore your messages, knowing how much you were suffering." "No more," Edward promised, pulling her closer. "No more solitary sacrifices. Whatever comes next, we face it together." When their lips finally met, it was like coming home after a long and painful exile. The kiss contained everything: apologies, promises, longing, hope. His hands held her face as if it were the most precious of treasures, while she clung to his shirt, fearing he might disappear if she let go. A brief knock on the door separated them. Daniel entered, looking embarrassed to interrupt the moment. "Pardon me, Judge Thompson, but the reporters are practically breaking down the doors. The court is asking for an official statement." Edward sighed, visibly composing himself. "Thank you, Agent Vance. I'll be there in 5 minutes." When Daniel left, Edward turned back to Letitia. "This is going to be a media circus. They're ready to turn everything into a scandal, or a soap opera romance." "And how should we deal with it?" she asked, worried. "With the truth," he replied simply. "Without hiding, without exaggerating. Just the truth. We met. We distanced ourselves when the conflict of interest arose, and now I am recusing myself from the case to preserve the integrity of the process." "And us? What happens now?" Edward looked at her with an intensity that made her heart race. "That depends on you. I know what I want, Letitia. I want to build something real with you, something that doesn't need to be hidden or protected. But I can't promise it will be easy." "I never wanted easy," she replied with a genuine smile. "I just wanted true." They left the chambers together, not hand in hand. There were still protocols to respect, but side by side, united in purpose. The crowd of journalists awaited them, cameras ready, recorders extended. Edward made a brief and direct statement without flourishes or excessive justifications. He explained that he would step down from the case due to a previous personal relationship with one of the witnesses, that this relationship had been interrupted precisely to avoid conflicts, and that his resignation from the magistracy was a personal decision to preserve both his integrity and that of the judicial system. "I served justice for 20 years, he concluded, and it is precisely out of respect for it that I step down now, so that there is no shadow of a doubt about the impartiality of the ongoing proceedings." The days that followed were a media storm: sensational headlines, legal analyses, ethical debates, speculation about their future. The judge and the architect, love or conspiracy. Thompson resigns for love, romance rocks New York justice. Corruption scandal uncovered. How an affair exposed $1 million scheme. Letitia received offers for exclusive interviews, book proposals, even invitations to television shows. She refused them all. Edward, always more reserved, practically isolated himself in his Upper East Side home, receiving only his lawyers and closest friends. 2 weeks after the fateful hearing, as the dust began to settle, Letitia received a simple message from Edward. "Central Park Conservatory Garden, tomorrow, 3 p.m. Just us." The Central Park Conservatory Garden, with views of the entire city, was one of Edward's favorite places, as she had discovered during their intimate conversations months earlier. It was a quiet spot, away from the spotlights and urban hustle. He was already waiting when she arrived, sitting on a wooden bench contemplating the horizon. He seemed different, more relaxed perhaps, the lines of tension around his eyes less pronounced, despite everything they had faced. "I never imagined that a resignation could be liberating," he commented when she sat beside him. "I always thought the robe was part of me." "And wasn't it?" Letitia asked, observing his profile against New York's blue sky. "It was an important part, yes," Edward admitted. "But not the only one, nor the most vital. I discovered that when you left my life, I realized I could lose the title, public respect, even professional purpose, and still move forward. But losing you, that left me empty." Letitia felt her heart race with his vulnerable honesty, so different from the contained man she had initially known. "And now," she asked, "what comes after the magistracy?" Edward smiled, turning to face her completely. "Several universities have already invited me to teach constitutional law. Some law firms have offered partnerships. There's a judicial transparency NGO that wants my involvement." "Sounds like you have plenty of options." "Not for work," he agreed. "But there's another more important decision I need to make." He took her hand, intertwining their fingers with a naturalness that suggested they had done this for years, not just stolen moments. "During these weeks of chaos, I realized something fundamental. I don't want to waste any more time. I don't want half-hearted relationships, nor happiness postponed by fear or convention." Edward took a deep breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "I know it's early. I know we're still in the eye of the media storm. I know it would be more sensible to wait, to give it time, but I also know with more certainty than I've ever had about anything in life that I want to build a future with you, Letitia." It wasn't exactly a formal proposal, but the intention was clear. Letitia felt tears forming, not of sadness or confusion this time, but of pure joy. "I don't want half measures anymore either," she replied. "I've spent my adult life controlling everything, measuring risks, avoiding vulnerability. And for what? To end up alone, with perfect architectural projects, but no one to share the achievements with." Her fingers squeezed his more tightly. "I want to build something real with you, Edward. Something that isn't defined by our titles or by what others think. Something that is ours." The kiss they shared on that park bench, with New York City spread out below them like a tapestry of light and color, sealed a silent pact. It wouldn't be easy. There were still ongoing investigations, testimonies to give, a media storm to navigate, but they would face everything together, with no more secrets, no more solitary sacrifices. In the months that followed, life took a turn neither of them could have predicted. Edward accepted a position as a professor of legal ethics at Columbia University, quickly becoming one of the most popular and respected faculty members. His practical knowledge, combined with a newly discovered ability for more accessible communication, turned his classes into highly sought-after events. Letitia, after testifying in various inquiries into the corruption scheme, was invited to join the Commission for the Reform of the Public Architecture Ethics Code. Her office, far from suffering from the exposure, gained clients who valued her integrity and courage. Henry Albright was arrested, along with Senator Peter Anderson and 3 prosecutors involved in the scheme. The investigation expanded, revealing a network of corruption that extended through various public bodies and private companies. The case became emblematic, a symbol that the system, despite its flaws, could still function when courageous people refused to yield. 6 months after the fateful hearing, Edward and Letitia decided it was time to formalize what everyone already knew. They chose a significant place for both of them, the terrace of the Plaza Hotel, where they had first talked on that night that changed their lives. This time, however, it wasn't an elegant ball, but an intimate ceremony with only close friends and family. Marcus, now a dear friend of the couple, conducted the civil ceremony. Daniel, who continued working for the FBI but maintained regular contact, was among the guests of honor. Edward's sister, who came from Boston especially for the occasion, smiled with tears in her eyes, commenting that she had never imagined seeing her austere older brother so visibly in love. Their vows were simple, sincere, without unnecessary flourishes, like themselves. Edward promised never again to let duty obscure love, never again to allow the fear of vulnerability to push him away from happiness. Letitia swore not to flee in difficult times, to trust that together they were, stronger than apart, to build a home based on truth and mutual support. The kiss that sealed their commitment was more than a ritual formality. It was a renewed promise, an acknowledgement of everything they had overcome to get there, and a celebration of the future they chose to build together. The party that followed was lively but discreet. Live music, delicious food, quality champagne, but without ostentation or excess. What mattered was not appearances or external impressions, but the genuine joy they shared. As the sun began to set over Central Park, casting golden and pink hues over the city, Edward led Letitia for a private moment on the same terrace where it all began. A year ago, if someone told me I'd be here, marrying the architect I publicly criticized, after resigning from the judiciary and facing a national scandal, Edward chuckled softly. You would have had that person arrested for contempt? Letitia completed with a playful smile. Probably, he admitted, embracing her by the waist as they contemplated the view. Life has an interesting sense of humor, and a poetic sense of justice, she added. New York's most feared judge and the city's most controlling architect, both forced to give up control to find something greater. Edward kissed her forehead tenderly. I don't feel like I gave up anything important. I just exchanged one form of integrity for a more complete one. The future still presented challenges. There would be more testimonies, more investigations in which both would be called to contribute. The media still watched them, though with less veracity as new scandals took the headlines. Their careers were in transition, rebuilding on new foundations. But there, on that terrace bathed in the golden light of the New York sunset, with the distant sound of the wedding party as a soundtrack, Edward and Letitia knew they had made the right choice. Not the easiest, not the most conventional, nor even the safest, but the only one that allowed them to be completely true with the world and with themselves. Ready for our next battle, Mrs. Thompson Miller? Edward asked, with a smile he reserved only for her. Always, Mr. Miller Thompson, Letitia replied, rising on her tiptoes to kiss him. And as the sun set on the horizon, marking the end of a day and the beginning of a starry night, they sealed once again the commitment they had made, to face life together, no more escapes, no more solitary sacrifices. Because in the end, both had learned that the fairest sentence did not come from law or social conventions, but from the heart. 2 years later, on a sunny Sunday morning, Edward watched Letitia sleeping beside him, the first rays of sun highlighting the auburn strands in her brown hair spread across the pillow. The peaceful expression on her face contrasted with the intensity she showed when awake. Always focused, always moving, always planning the next project. Now more than ever, she needed those moments of rest. Edward let his hand rest lightly on the small bump on Letitia's belly, still almost imperceptible under the sheet. 4 months pregnant, and she continued working at the same intense pace as always, only reluctantly agreeing to reduce her office hours after insistence from the doctor and himself. The news of the pregnancy had been unexpected, but deeply welcome. After the turbulence of their first years together, their lives had finally found a comfortable balance. Edward was now coordinator of the Constitutional Law Department, respected by colleagues and students alike. Letitia had become a reference in ethical and sustainable architecture, frequently invited to speak about the importance of transparency in public projects. Together, they had created the Transparent Justice Foundation, a non-profit organization dedicated to protecting victims of judicial manipulation and promoting reforms in the system. The work was rewarding, though challenging. Threats had diminished over time, but never completely ceased, the price for confronting such a deeply rooted, corrupt system. The news of the pregnancy brought new considerations. Security issues that once seemed manageable now gained new urgency. Conversations about moving, perhaps to a larger house, perhaps to a smaller city, perhaps to another state, became more frequent. Letitia stirred slightly, her eyes opening slowly, adjusting to the morning light. Finding Edward's gaze fixed on her, she smiled sleepily. "How long have you been watching me sleep?" she asked, her voice still husky with sleep. "Not long enough," he replied, leaning in to kiss her softly. "You talk in your sleep, you know." "Lie," she protested, stretching like a cat in the sun. "What did I supposedly say?" "Something about Doric columns and sustainable spaces," Edward improvised with a playful smile. "Even when you're sleeping, you're working." Letitia playfully slapped his arm, laughing. "And you, even when you're awake, you're analyzing behavior. Once a judge, always a judge." That joke was a recurring one between them, about how, despite the changes in their professional lives, their essences remained the same. Edward still analyzed everything with the critical eye of a magistrate. Letitia still designed and organized, like the meticulous architect she was. "How are you two this morning?" Edward asked, his hand returning to rest on her belly. 3, Letitia corrected with a secret smile. Edward blinked, trying to process the information. 3, the doctor confirmed yesterday when you were at that faculty meeting, she explained, covering his hand with hers. Twins. It's still too early to know the sex, but it's definitely 2. Edward's expression went from surprise to shock, then to absolute joy. "Twins," he repeated, as if testing the word. "2 babies? At the same time?" "That's generally the definition of twins, yes," Letitia teased, delighted by his reaction. "Why didn't you tell me yesterday?" "You came home exhausted from the meeting, and I wanted to see your expression in a quiet moment," she explained. "It was worth the wait." Edward pulled her into a tight hug, burying his face in her hair. "You continue to surprise me even after all this time." "I promise to keep trying," she replied, snuggling against his chest, "for at least 50 more years or so." The life they had built together was not perfect. There were still challenges, worries, difficult days. The case that had united them had left scars and enemies. But on that sunny Sunday morning, with the promise of not 1 but 2 new beginnings growing inside Letitia, the future seemed bright and full of possibilities. They had learned the hard way that life rarely follows meticulous plans or definitive sentences. That sometimes the greatest acts of courage do not occur in courtrooms or grand projects, but in the daily decisions to trust, to stay, to choose love, even when it would be easier to retreat. And as the sun rose in the New York sky, casting light on the new day, Edward and Letitia allowed themselves a few more moments of tranquility together, knowing that regardless of the challenges the future brought, they would face each one as they had promised, side by side. No more escapes, no more solitary sacrifices. Because in the end, both had learned the most important lesson of all, that life, like justice, architecture, and love, is not about perfection, but about integrity, about building something that endures even when the strongest winds blow, about creating spaces, physical and emotional, where truth can exist in all its imperfect complexity. And that, perhaps, was the greatest work either of them had ever created.